What's up, Nowstalgia? Dave here with a review of Fantastic Four, The First Step, the 37th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A good 2 months and change since we got Thunderbolts earlier this year. And yeah, Fantastic Four, I mean, what more can you say? This is one of the most significant, most famous, most storied franchises within the Marvel Comics world. Always been a very robust comics performer, just one of the big units within Marvel alongside the X-Men and the Avengers. And of course, we've seen the Fantastic Four on screen before, most recently the ill-fated Fox reboot from Josh Trank 10 years ago, and before that, the two films in 2005 and 2007. None of those films are particularly well regarded, although I will say as a kid I enjoyed, the 2005 and 2007 versions without much critical eye. Nonetheless, people have been clamoring for these characters to show up in the MCU. And, Disney and Marvel Studios have had the film rights to these characters for a while now. The Fox deal was 2019. There's been a long time coming, and we're just finally starting to really see the fruits of all those new characters coming into the fold. Of course, that really kicked off in earnest last year with Deadpool and Wolverine, but Deadpool and Wolverine was the culmination of the stories for two characters we were used to in the Fox universe of things with Marvel, obviously. This is, a real genuine attempt to restart the Fantastic Four and bring them into the MCU as, players to come as the Marvel storytelling continues to evolve within its third decade here. And this film is coming to us from one of the most successful creators in the MCU of late, Matt Shakman, who of course directed WandaVision. The MCU, as we've been talking about for the last few movies, has been in a state of decline at worst, malaise at best, somewhere in between. And we've certainly talked about that quality problem for some time, especially with the glut of shows that showed up on Disney Plus, an era that's firmly officially over and in the rear view from what everything that's been said publicly. But you're seeing it in the film performance. Yes, Deadpool and Wolverine was $1 billion+ grosser, did great last year, but Captain America: Brave New World earlier this year grossed a hair over $400 million worldwide. Thunderbolts didn't even quite make it to $400 million worldwide. It's a different time for superhero film in general, right? And now we're in a situation where, something really heralded and really well regarded, like DC's Superman reboot this year, that's going to top out around $600 million. Fantastic Four: The First Steps also seemingly not going to be $1 billion grosser. We have to reset our expectations with these movies. But taking the business side of things away again, it does seem like this is a movie that feels like the step forward narratively. If I think about how I like Thunderbolts, Captain America: Brave New World, not very good, a movie that we knew was hacked to bits and had troubled production. Thunderbolts, though, was good and had some creativity to it in terms of everything with Louis Pullman's character, right? I think there was an exceeding of expectations, frankly, given the characters that were involved in that movie. And I think despite all that fan attention and good response, you see that box office performance for a movie around a small group of characters that aren't super famous. That being said, Thunderbolts for the most part looked visually like all other MCU movies do, in the sense that it was shot in Atlanta, and you can tell. And yes, there's some cool sequences regarding what Sentry's powers do that were visually different, but for the most part, Thunderbolts looked like an MCU movie. Fantastic Four: The First Steps has really impeccable production design that sets itself apart from past MCU entries. The 60s Jetson-esque aesthetic really works and also is in sync with this film's tone of its storytelling. Overall, I think this movie is in more good than great camp, but it certainly gets the job done of establishing Marvel's first family, getting you excited for the future of these characters in the greater MCU storytelling, and by eschewing the traditional origin story just like DC's Superman 2025 did, you make some progress with the emotional family stakes that are central to these characters. So I think the movie's successful, even if it doesn't reach the lofty heights that maybe we would have expected, given the brand name A-list status of these characters. It feels like ancient history too at this point, but if you remember, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which was of course May 2022, gave us, with the alternate Earth scenario that we saw, John Krasinski's cameo performance as Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards, of course, of the Fantastic Four. And Krasinski had, of course, been a long-standing fan cast for the role, got to dabble, in a sense, with it in that movie. But then, in the lead-up to this Marvel Studios' earnest attempt to do this movie, I remember, the casting, kind of, leaking out, and there was a lot of talk that the cast that we ended up getting was going to be the cast. It seemed like pretty locked in. Of course, that would be Pedro Pascal as Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, Vanessa Kirby as Sue Storm, Invisible Woman, Eben Moss-Bachrach as Ben Grimm, The Thing, and Joseph Quinn as Johnny Storm, Human Torch. And it's an exciting cast overall, right? And I think the demerit, if you're going to take one, is that when Pedro Pascal was cast in this role, I think there was some, sighing that certain observers might have had because, Pascal has been around. He's been everywhere as a leading man lately. And we were thinking that when he was cast in this role, let alone the year we've just had with Pedro Pascal, in the last 12 months, he was in Gladiator 2, The Last of Us Season 2, Ari Aster's Eddington, of course, the lead of Fantastic Four: The First Steps, and a key figure in Celine Song's Materialists. That's a lot of Pedro. And the guy's a movie star, the guy's popular, but there's been some, overexposure thoughts. Now, I think Pedro as Reed Richards is interesting. And I think all the characterization that you get in this movie is interesting in the sense that this movie is really like an ensemble piece. There's no true lead of the film. Ultimately, you get more Reed and Sue than you do Ben and Johnny, but it's almost more about the full piece, the team, the entire time. So you don't get a ton of uber intellect, Illuminati member genius Reed Richards. That's not really in this movie. And Pedro, I think he does a much better job with the kind of emotional beats of the character, that he's playing pretty straight, pretty down the middle, pretty logical. I think he does a pretty good job of being emotive for that kind of personality in the role. And he thankfully gets to play off Vanessa Kirby, who I think does a really nice job with the character, despite the fact that she has to do a lot of the tropey female character shit. She has to literally give birth and be a protective mom throughout much of this film, much of this story. But despite all that, I think her natural just gravitas as a performer, right? There's such a lavishness to Vanessa Kirby that, of course, we loved seeing so much of that in the Mission Impossible movies recently. I think she's able to kind of rise above maybe some shortcomings with what Sue Storm's day-to-day is in this movie. So I think I liked her probably the most of the four. Eben Moss-Bachrach, which was obviously an amazing look for him to get cast in a Marvel movie after his Emmy Award-winning success on The Bear as Richie, which is really a classic performance, one of the best TV performances of the last few years. It's just so powerful from him. He's great. Unsurprisingly, he has less to do in this movie and less opportunity to get things across in this movie. Richie on The Bear is such a firebrand, such a firecracker, with emotion and id and raw feeling. Ben Grimm in this movie gets to kind of be lonely and longing in time in fits and starts in the movie. Perhaps having the hots for Natasha Lyonne's, character who's from his neighborhood growing up in this version of New York City, but you don't get too much of that. And his friendship with Reed, there's a trust that's communicated pretty early, but there's not like a ton of depth there. I did enjoy Joseph Quinn as Johnny Storm. You know, they definitely sand down the edges of, you know, the traditional Johnny Storm character, who was much more flamboyant and more of a playboy, and that's only barely referenced, you know, in this movie. You know, this is a far cry from Chris Evans's portrayal in the Fox films, for example, which was very amusingly referenced in a surprise way in Deadpool and Wolverine last year, which I thought was quite clever. But Joseph Quinn, I think he does get to exhibit this sense of, you know, trying to prove himself, a chip on his shoulder type thing, get his respect, all those things. So, you know, I liked it. You know, and I would have liked more Johnny, the same way I would have liked more Emperor Gaeta in Gladiator 2, right? I like Joseph Quinn. I think he was great on A Quiet Place Day One last year as well, and, you know, playing off Lupita. So, and for what he was, for a small ensemble piece role, he was good in Alice Garland's Warfare this year as well. I'm in on Joseph Quinn. I'm excited to see him be a Beetle, you know, for Sam Mendes in the years to come. But there's definitely more Johnny Storm I think he can give, to put it there. Yeah, you know, I think the as I said in the beginning, the visuals of this movie I think really help you forgive a lot, because I think this movie is aesthetically just impressive, and I think the world building that they do and how that informs us skipping ahead of the origin story. You get these montages and recaps basically of how the Fantastic Four got their powers, how they got their status as the protector of this earth, and it's communicated to us very briskly, very economically, and it's done in like a newsreel, you know, late night talk show type fashion that tonally is fitting the world we've been given. I think that's all pretty clever. I think the biggest shortcoming with this movie, and probably why this movie is, you know, it's almost like it's more successful in real life, in real terms, right, in terms of establishing the Fantastic Four and getting the MCU storytelling moving forward again, playing off Thunderbolts, tying us into Avengers Doomsday. But, you know, the film itself in a vacuum, it definitely suffers from the villains, you know. And of course, that would be, you know, very famous A-list villains for the Fantastic Four, namely the Silver Surfer, the Herald, of course, of Galactus. And if we reflect back on Fantastic Four, The Rise of the Silver Surfer from 2007 from Fox, that film notoriously, infamously tried to change the depiction of Galactus, of course, this cosmic entity, space god, iconic, you know, Marvel Comics villain, one of the most famous and popular Marvel villains in the, you know, history of the comics there. The Fox film changes that character into this inanimate force of nature, you know, this big like space storm that sucks up planets, and it just doesn't work at all. In this case, Galactus is pretty true to his, you know, form changing from the comics, and the iconic, of course, purple look and the, you know, spiky helmet and all those things. And I like the scale of him when he gets to Earth in the third act. I think that it is cool to see. I think the movie does a decent job of communicating the existential threat that is Galactus has decided to feast on your planet. Like, I think all of that's there. I think the issue with this, though, is like Julia Garner's Silver Surfer. God, I mean, I think she's so limited in this role, and obviously we know how good Julia Garner is, Emmy winner. You know, she's an exciting talent. Again, another person who's very emotive, very emotional, and yes, she's going to be like caked up in the getup as the metallic character that she's playing, but the Silver Surfer was a character that's supposed to have a lot more nuance and conflict within. It's very like surface level. It's very like, you can tell right away where it's probably going to end up. So the connection, if you can call it that, between the Silver Surfer and Johnny Storm, and that being the spark that turned the tide, so to speak, it's a bit thin. And I think the movie still works because of it, but like, I think you don't have enough really investment in that sort of thing. And, kind of along these lines in terms of how the villains work, there's no like epic set piece or anything like that. And, over the years, we've talked about Marvel set pieces as often being the least exciting things in Marvel movies, right? It's like the quips and then the character interaction is often more interesting than the actual watching of the combat. And of course, there's exceptions to that, like this 3-way fight in Civil War, for example. But in this case, you don't get to really see like the Fantastic Four like being their superpowered selves with a ton to it, right? Like no like standout like Mr. Fantastic being super stretchy and bendy. Johnny flies around with fire enough. That's fine. That's the flashiest one of the four. The Thing's always powered up as the Thing. He doesn't get to do anything too crazy. And, obviously, Invisible Woman, Sue Storm, her powers are on full display actually throughout the movie. And I think CGI-wise, obviously, so relying on that with this character and her powers. I think visually it's a bit hard to communicate like her powers sometimes. Like, it's not that dissimilar from how they've done like, Wanda the Scarlet Witch and her powers, except this time they're not like bright red. So like you can't really like track necessarily what she's doing when she's not doing her invisibility thing and she's doing more of her like energy power stuff. Maybe you could have visually presented that in a different way. I'm not really sure. Of course, the other, big aspect of this is that from the very beginning of this movie, the threat's established very early on, and there's a actually kind of unexpected like going out to space and getting clapped by Galactus type scene that I wasn't necessarily expecting. So the movie's very cosmic, very sci-fi, especially the back half of Act 1 in that moment. But Sue giving birth to Franklin Richards in the very beginning of this movie, like the very first scene is her realizing she's pregnant. And then Franklin Richards being kind of the movie's MacGuffin because it's the source of Galactus's desires once he learns of his existence, and source of conflict between the Fantastic Four and the members of Earth they're trying to protect. It's I think it's a bit surprising, right? Like there's some funny jokes that Kirby gets off as she's giving birth in the middle of outer space, which is crazy. But yeah, I wasn't necessarily expecting that sort of conflict. But then again, I guess it plays into the themes of the first family, and this is literally the expansion of that you have. The film definitely like yada yadas Reed's intellect and his the plans they make to save Earth and things like that, and the science behind all that. Like you got to kind of go with that. Again, I think like tonally and like aesthetically how they've set up this fictional Earth, 60s-esque vibe Earth with a lot of global harmony present. Like I think it all works. It's all pretty consistent with that. So you just kind of have to go with it and just take their thoughts and ride. There's a homage, if you could call it that, to Interstellar here when they are fleeing Galactus and the Surfer and they slingshot around a black hole, which was unsurprisingly a lot more epic in Interstellar than it ends up being in this movie. But it's still cool to see for what it was, I suppose. But as I said, ultimately, this does feel like a 2 for 2 for their last two type situation with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because the success of Thunderbolts, the reception to it, anyway, and then its post-credit scene, which of course was showing the Fantastic Four arriving on the Earth we know from the MCU, directly ties into, of course, watching this Fantastic Four movie, which then has a post-credit scene of Doctor Doom, of all people, visiting Franklin Richards 4 years after the events of the movie. Of course, that directly tying into Avengers Doomsday. And now we have a 1 year wait until Marvel and Sony's Spider-Man Brand New Day comes out. And that will be interesting. We know that will be successful and popular because it's, Spider-Man, for crying out loud. But where Spider-Man left off with No Way Home back in 2021, no one knows who Spider-Man is anymore. So the speculation is that it's going to be more street-level, traditional Spider-Man as he's anonymous once again. We'll see how that pans out, but I think this is a really good post-credit scene. It's an exciting one, and even if overall this Fantastic Four movie is just good, I think we've clearly established this team as characters to invest in moving forward in the MCU storytelling, and that is pretty exciting. And however you felt about Thunderbolts, right? Because that movie had a team as well. This is A-list. This is top of the bill team for the MCU. So it's exciting. So overall, I'm happy with the movie. I would have liked it to be a little tighter with Silver Surfer personally, but I was still pretty impressed with the film's visual approach the entire time and its tone. So I'm a bit more forgiving of the movie's shortcomings here. But yeah, let me know, where are you at with Marvel? How did you like Fantastic Four, the first steps? Are you looking forward to the future of the MCU? Let me know. And for more movie reviews, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.